sometimes the letters change, and it's not always easy to see why. So, when we have a verb that we add ed to, right? The first thing to remember is that when it doesn't add ed, when it adds something else, there's always a reason why and a pattern to it, right? So, we call these verbs irregular because they don't follow a simple rule. So, regular means they follow a pattern, a rule, right? These are what we call regular. Now, it's a little bit incorrect to call them regular and irregular because it just means this doesn't follow this rule. But it has its own rules, its own patterns, all right? So those are also things we can understand. Okay, so in German we have this pattern. A lot of our shorter verbs in English do this. But when a verb is in this group here, then we still have a very strong pattern for how we add letters at the end. If a word already has E, right? For example, place. All right? So, for example, you can place the pen on the table, right? A verb like this, what we add is just D. We don't add an extra E. This is 简单了解, right? 因为加第二个 E, 所以它的意思有可能一样，但是它的发音很不一样。If we try to do this, now we have to make this into a sound, right? So we don't do this. When we have a word that ends with a normal consonant, like for example, cook. Okay. Then after this, well, we can't just add a D, so we need to add an E in between. The better way to understand this is that it's not sometimes we only add D, but usually the rule is we add ED, right? The better way to understand it is we add a D, 加 D. 它后面加 D 有问题, right? So sometimes we have to add the E as well, okay? Now, when we have simple consonants here, it's no problem. Some verbs end with a vowel, but in English there aren't a lot of verbs that end with an O, right? Because we have verbs like go, but then they have go, went, gone, right? If we have a verb that ends with an A, it's always from another language anyways. Verbs that end with U, same problem. So most of the time our verbs don't end with vowels, but they might end with a Y. So the problem here is that when we end with a Y, we can have two different ways that we use the Y. If this is simply an E sound, it's just really the letter I. This word and this word are the same thing. We never end a word like this with just an I, because that's how English letters work, because that's how Latin taught us. Latin 没有 Y. Latin J and Y, these two letters are both from this. The problem with this is that if we have a longer word, we didn't used to put a dot on the I, it was just a line. And if there's a line at the end of a word like that, it's hard to tell. Is this a letter or is it just a mark? So because of this problem, we change this into a Y. Okay? Same thing at the beginning of a lot of words. Not every word, if this is a prefix, 它的意思说 not, 所以这个音节有它自己的意思 right? 还有地方, there's a lot of places like Italy and Ireland and Iceland, 有很多的字前面有 I. But in a lot of places, our I at the beginning changes to a Y. Especially if it's I and then another vowel. For example, we don't do this, we change it to this, right? And when we have it at the end of the word, for this reason, then it's easy to change it back. So when we change studied to studied, it's just because it's not at the end of the word anymore. So it can go back to being a normal I. Okay? Now in this one here, it's a little bit different. In English, there are only 3 ways where we ever see the Y in the middle of the word. Okay? 1, do you remember? Y 是哪一个语言来的? Which language is Y from?
Greek.
It's Greek. So when we have a Greek word, for example, psychology. In Greek words, we don't use the letter I very much. This Y is in these Greek words because they're from Greek. 他们是希腊文来的. Right? 希腊文的 I 是 Y. That's actually what we call it. 西班牙文的 Y 叫 Y. They call it a Greek I. And the same thing in French. Right? When we talk about this letter, we call it a Greek I. So in a lot of Greek words in English, 希腊文来的字没有 I 是用 Y. 字中间也是用 Y. Okay? Or we do this when we have, for example, 2 words that both end with Y, or that where one of them ends with Y, and we put them together. When this becomes a single word, we keep the Y here because it used to be at the end of the word. And the only other reason is when there's a vowel before and after. So 有3个母音，中间的是 I, and we需要用 Y. So that's why with a word like this, it doesn't change to an I, because there are now 3 vowels, so the middle one has to stay as a Y. Okay? So it's a really good question, because it's not something you have time to study every time in English class, right? And most of the English books and English teachers just say, 就是这样子，不要问, right? It's a 需要问, you have to ask. So, do you guys have any other questions about these? 一个字后面加 D 还是 ED? 有什么问题? What about pronunciation? 它的发音有没有特别的问题? Like, for example, how do we say this word here? pronunciation is the same as in this word here. What about this one? Ini kan atid, right? 为什么要加这个